And so I may be LARPing in your community and doing all these challenges and putting things on the timeline, but like I'm self-motivated in my doing that, right? I haven't effectively joined your cult yet, right? And if that TGE happens and doesn't meet or exceed my expectations, like I'm out, I'm on to the next one, right? Or even if it does, I might still be out, right? And so this is part of why I think also it's really helpful to think about that 95%, because like, I'm not going to name names. Like I have a lot of friends at newer chains that are owning the timeline and everybody's talking about them. And I'm literally telling them like, I hope you have a plan for after TVGE, because these 20,000 loyal community members aren't as loyal as you think they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so once folks get past that point, that is when I typically get a lot of phone calls. They're like, we don't know what to do anymore, and it's like, well, you got to start doing marketing. And you have to think about, one, how do I retain that existing community? Two, how do I, engage them? And three, how do I turn them into word of mouth marketers that start to bring their friends and family in,
Okay. And then like, what are some challenges you see with like crypto gaming and like currently or like the next 5 years? And I know we touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So I think like, a lot of people ask me, they're like, where do you think mass adoption comes from? Right. And I personally, as someone that's been early in like a lot of industries, like I was early in digital, I was early in AR, VR, machine learning, AI, autonomous vehicles, all this stuff, right? Like I've kind of seen it over and over again. And so I personally think it's either going to come from gaming, meaning there's going to be a game that onboards millions of people. It's going to be from a social DApp, and I wouldn't even say social fi, but a social app that scales very quickly, brings in millions of people, right? Or it's going to come from the consumer side, meaning an Amazon integrates, Skale into their Prime member program. And the next thing you know, millions and millions of Americans are on the chain, right? The challenge right now has to do with like regulation clarity, right? So I live in LA where we have, Activision and Epic and Amazon Gaming and all these companies, right? And they are interested in blockchain, right? Like people think they're not. I think what it boils down to is two things. One, they don't have regulation clarity, right? So if you're one of these big traditional game publishers that has a very, very substantial viable business, why would you do something that could potentially jeopardize that and put your company in trouble, right? Yep. And so what I think will happen is if we get regulation clarity, which is somewhat aligned, I think, with the politics and the election, what you could end up seeing is this mass adoption happening much faster, right? And what I mean by that is, let's say you're Activision, you're not going to integrate blockchain into all your games. You're probably going to launch another game that has blockchain components in it. You're going to start testing that, learning, and then eventually maybe pivoting into something that's like more 360, like a marketplace, right? And I do know that a lot of these folks have been experimenting behind the scenes. So what happens is, let's say Activision does that. Well, then what happens? Well, if they want to put $100 million in marketing behind a game, they can do it. If they want to put 100, AAA developers behind a game, they can do it, right? And so I do think like the traditional game studios, if and when they decide to jump in, could very quickly bring gamers in, right? Like that's one thing that could happen. The thing that could happen right now, which I think is again like a little bit more of a dice roll, is you could have what I call like the Stardew Valley effect, right? And so like I'm a big Switch guy because I'm on the plane a lot, right? And so anyone that doesn't know Stardew Valley, it's like a farming game, but it was an indie game, right? And it became like very, very successful. So I do think in general, like the opportunity right now is, now that we have real game developers on Scale versus just, guy in his mom's basement, if one of them builds a really fun indie game, and I'll give you a couple to check out. And actually there's one that I think is really interesting too. If those become kind of indie breakout hits, they could have the same effect. It's just the likelihood of an indie breakout versus a giant studio bringing the masses in. It's just a lot harder, So I think a lot of it has to do with regulation. But I'll give you a couple examples. Like on Epic right now, there's a really cool shooter game called Stray Shot. So I think that's one where right now I think you can waitlist for it and they're doing like batches of new players. But that's one where, I grew up on like Doom and Bond N64, right? Like, there's a lot of guys like me that love FPS games, look at CSGO and things like that. So I do think something like that could drive some pretty big numbers on chain. The other one that I'm really fascinated by, it's also on the Epic Game Store. It's early, so you have to kind of waitlist to get in. It's this game called Wits. What is this sorcery? And I'll explain why it's interesting to me because I'm like a product guy, right? So they're launching physical trading cards. So very similar, like I'm in my 40s, right? So we grew up on like Magic and Pokemon, right? Okay. So what they have is Magic, Pokemon type cards that are really, really nice. They're actually like pretty thick and heavy because they have chips inside of them, right? And it's also like an RWA thing. And so what it is very similar to like a Magic. It's like a TCG game that you play on Epic, right? But the cool part is I go to my local comic shop, or I go to Walmart, or I go to Amazon, or I buy them online. I rip my packs. I get these exclusive cards. I tap my phone on them because, again, gas-free invisible blockchain, those cards are now inputted into my game player profile. So when you think about the numbers that things like Magic and Pokemon have done over the years, and you think about this as a game that has touch points at retail, touch points online, like all these different things, like this is interesting to me, right? So something like that, or a great FPS game, these things could be breakout hits, could drive mass adoption, or we could see an Epic or an Activision bring in, massive numbers depending on regulation. Yeah.
That's awesome because I used to play Magic the Gathering, so I know like those trading card games are like real world assets. Like you got a black opal or something like that. Those things sell for a huge amount of money.
Well, and I'll tell you why I think it's so interesting is like, like I'm getting sample packs. So I'll do like a rip on Twitter or something when I get them. But like to your point, first thing I do, I go buy my cards, I input them into my game, I start playing with them. Next thing I know, I rip a pack and I find this super rare card. It would make obvious sense to me that Wits will eventually build a marketplace for their cards, right? And imagine that this business is now controlling, the buying and selling of all these in-game assets, both physically and digitally.